So I'm Annie Mason. I'm the Program Director of Elementary Teacher Education in our Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the university, and I'm also a lecturer in that department. So people here who already know me as an instructor or as a colleague know that I'm someone who believes that we all teach and learn through story. And I think that when we pause to really dig into the stories that shape all of our lives, we can better both understand their complexities and manage them as we try to solve problems related to those stories. So in that spirit, I'm going to tell you 3 different stories today that I think will do a little bit of poking at the notion of the achievement gap itself as something that organizes a lot of our thought about education today. Try not to pay too much attention to the title because I wrote that a long time ago and deviated. Okay, so before I get into the stories, take a look at this little chart up here. This is something that, again, people who've seen me in my classes know that I rely on these 3 nested circles quite a bit. And I do that because I think it's a really handy way to remind ourselves that anything, whether we're talking about schools or society or really anything, I'm making an argument here through this illustration that everything that I do as an individual person is nested within institutions, which are nested within a larger system. So any individual decision that I make or any individual interaction that I have has all these other consequences and relationships that are shaping the outcomes of those interactions. This is going to keep showing up, so you don't have to memorize it or anything. Okay, so story 1 is these gaps themselves. I purposely used just the word gap and not any particular one, partially as a reminder to myself that when I frame my story of these gaps later on, I want to acknowledge that I'm resting on the shoulders of a lot of people, starting as long ago as Dr. Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech, who identified that this country owes its children of color a debt, and that we haven't yet repaid. And we keep getting reminded of that, and I think we also, as we keep getting reminded of that, we keep finding different ways to forget it as well. So I'm going to tell what I believe to be the dominant story first around these gaps. And when I say dominant story, I mean this is the story that is repeated over and over again about kind of what's happening in schools around the differences in who's achieving and how and why. And also it's so dominant that I think often we're talking about it without even saying the words about it. So the way that this story goes to me is that there's an acknowledgement in the dominant story about our gaps that it does start with some injustice. There's historical injustice that's the foundation of the differences in how children experience and succeed in school in the US. And then we see that part of the response to that at the institutional level is that to reduce those gaps, we're trying to increase opportunities. And then I think from there, we're believing that when we expand opportunities, those gaps decrease. You might notice that I have this red arrow pointing only down on this side. And the reason that I put that there is to identify that in this story, I think we have a difficulty in that we really only move one direction. And I think that there's a fallacy there that we can't just identify the historical injustice and then move on from there. It's something that we have to keep returning to, keep kind of re-critiquing and potentially even rebuild from. Story 2. Also a pretty popular story, but a whole lot less dominant than the big dominant story of the gaps. That story is culturally relevant pedagogy, which I would say is becoming something that I can say is widely understood or widely believed as a promising approach to reducing the gaps from story 1. So a quick version of the culturally relevant pedagogy story, and you might notice that when I talk about it, I'm going to go backwards from how often scholars will talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. I'm going to talk first about the societal level where we're saying it's important for culturally relevant pedagogues to work with people to recognize and critique the unjust social order. So again, that acknowledgement that we're living within an unjust set of systems. And then in this story, the story of culturally relevant pedagogy, we also believe that at the institutional level, we should be building culturally competent people and institutions within them. Institutions and people within them. And that if we do that, a happy consequence might be that we will advance student learning. And maybe we'll even push out ideas about what that student learning can look like. So here, in this one, the arrow is going both directions because I do believe that culturally relevant pedagogy offers the opportunity to poke a little more at all of the levels of analysis. But I also think that it's not giving us the opportunity yet to shake the system the whole thing is actually resting on. And to me, shaking that system, one of the things that I think that has to mean is naming whiteness as a major component of what holds it all together. Story 3 is an actual person who is part of the systems and the stories in numbers 1 and 2. So I mentioned at the beginning that I think that humans are complex. And anytime we tell any story about a human, whether we know it or not, we're drawing on all 3 of these levels: the institutional relationships they have, the way they fit within systems, and then their individual life carries all of that with it. So I think that stories about any one person can help us better understand all 3 of those things. So Dalmar is one person who lives a very complicated life that I think helps us see ourselves better in general. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about him and then how he fits and doesn't fit into these stories. So I knew Dalmar when he was a 3rd grader, and he was a student who had pretty much every label you can think of a kid having. He had something in that category. He is diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, receives English learner services. His IEP is for emotional behavioral disorder. He was also the only Somali American child in his 3rd grade class that year. And he also was identified as having learning disabilities. So this was a complicated child with a complicated relationship to school. His days at school were usually what I call in my writing about Dalmar a parade of interventions. So there were days when I would track his movements throughout the entire day, track what he was doing at every minute of the day. And there were days when there were 5 minutes where Dalmar was just being a kid at school, often not in social interaction or academic interaction with other children. And it probably isn't a surprise to you to hear me say that he was miserable. One of the things that Dalmar's 3rd grade teacher and I came to understand about him was that we talked about him having been forced into a trade by his school. And the way we looked at that was he was being forced to trade his sense of self for their sense of achievement, and his sense of value as a person of color for their norm that perpetually assumed whiteness and asked him to strive toward that norm. Thank you. So Dalmar received an education that was steeped in the tenets of both story 1 and story 2. And if that's not clear, we can talk about it in the questions. But yet the structure around him wasn't shaken. He was still existing only in service of his striving toward that norm. So I want to argue, and I argue here and in other pieces of writing about Dalmar, that we should be trying to look at kids like this as canaries in the coal mine around our whole construction of achievement in public education. I will say that I don't think his achievement matters, and I purposely actually don't ever talk about how he achieved or didn't at school, because if the costs have to be that high, I don't actually care what it looked like, because he shouldn't be paying that cost. So I believe that we need to commit to more significant shifts in the structure itself, which definitely for me involves decentralizing whiteness as the measuring stick against which we're all measured. So I don't have a new story to tell yet, but maybe someday. What I'm arguing here is that the social order is evident in the stories that we tell, right? The dominant story of the achievement gap, whether we want it to or not, is affirming the status quo of what achievement looks like without threatening power and privilege, and that this happens at the expense of kids like Dalmar. I think to actually shake the structure that makes this seem natural for someone like Dalmar to be asked to strive toward that norm of whiteness, we need to not just critique, but also take action against the social order. There is a full paper that if you're interested, you can take a look at. Thank you.